Serhai, if I could begin with you, what is the status of Chernobyl now, since that drone struck its $2 billion outer shield on Valentine's Day 2025?
It's an honor to speak to such distinguished audience. Thank you for invitation. Thank you for the question, but I would like to use this opportunity to enlighten more broader questions, if you allow, Mr. Chairman.
Do that and maybe answer my question as well.
Yeah, for sure. So until 2022, the global concept of nuclear safety was based on purely technical parameters. Compliance with nuclear and radiation safety standards during design, construction, and operation of NPP, equipment reliability, personnel adherence to operational regulations. However, Russian aggression has shifted this issue into an entirely different dimension. Today, nuclear safety is no longer just a matter of engineering solutions, but primarily a question of the physical integrity of facilities under the conditions of active hostilities. The occupation of the Chernobyl and Zaporizhia nuclear power plants has demonstrated how a system of international guarantees built over decades can be undermined in a matter of hours. On February 24th, 2022, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant became the first nuclear facility in world history to be seized by military force. This did not take weeks. It happened within the very first hours of the full-scale invasion. I must remind you that the offensive on Kyiv began precisely through the territory of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Why is this critical for the security context? Because that was the moment a fundamental international principle was shattered. Nuclear facilities are inviolable. The occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant lasted 35 days. During this time, staff worked at gunpoint without proper rotation. Shifts lasted 600 hours, and for some even longer, all without reliable communication with the outside world and their families. This experience served as a testing ground for the aggressor before the seizure of the Zaporizhia NPP. Had the world's reaction in February 22 been immediate and severe, we would not be facing 4 years of occupation at Zaporizhia NPP today. We must admit that current international control mechanisms are failing their primary function. This effectively signifies a profound crisis of the atoms for peace concept proclaimed by US President Dwight Eisenhower back in 1953. That initiative was the foundation for the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the entire current system of international nuclear law. At that time, world leaders agreed that nuclear energy must serve exclusively for progress and civilization, not as a tool of fear. Yet today, through the occupation of Ukrainian NPPs, we see the opposite. It has become clear that the IAEA mandate and international agreements lack effective instruments to counter state-level nuclear terrorism. Without real enforcement mechanism, the idea of peaceful atom turns into a tool for military blackmail, which completely contradicts the principles upon which the security system was built. The global nuclear safety system was based on the assumption that all participants are rational actors who understand the consequences of a catastrophe. But it turned out that no international institution possesses real leverage over an aggressor state. A total revision of approaches is required. Nuclear terrorism must result in the complete isolation of the aggressor from global energy markets without any exceptions. Why is this urgent now? Because the world has already realized that renewable energy sources cannot fully meet current electricity demands. The boom in data centers and artificial intelligence has led many countries to develop new nuclear builds, including Poland. Or for instance, United States is considering to relaunch previously closed NPPs. Unquestionably, nuclear power is the only way to satisfy these growing needs. However, a paradox arises. Russia's senseless and irresponsible actions in Ukraine serve as a reminder that nuclear power is not ordinary energy industry. This situation jeopardizes the entire strategy of the current nuclear renaissance. We must understand, mankind will not forgive the nuclear community for another Chernobyl.
No, and sir, hi, you're covering a lot of issues there, and we're
Last paragraph, if you wish.
Okay.
If you allow.
I think so, because I'd like to ask you a question, yeah.
And if we do not create effective safeguards against military threats, the nuclear industry may simply cease to develop out of fear of catastrophe. In just 2 days, we will mark the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. For decades, we, and by we I mean the global nuclear community, have said never again, believing the main lessons we learned. We improved reactor designs, trained personnel, established regulatory systems. But nuclear safety is not just about the thickness of concrete or the numbers of sensors or systems. It is above all the responsibility of politicians and institutions. Nuclear safety is not guaranteed once and all by default. And it is the result of meticulous daily work at all levels.
Now, Serhii, you mentioned nuclear safety there, and that's exactly the point I want to ask you about.
Please.
What is the status of Chernobyl after that drone strike? We would like to know.
It's a provocative question. We are here. We will host a lot of delegations in 2 days in Chernobyl. It means the situation under control. But if you just cut this phrase and put into the headlines, it will not reflect the truth. Because, of course, this unique facility, it means shelter object, another name is sarcophagus, which was covered by new safe confinement. The idea of new safe confinement was to create conditions for further dismantling of the sarcophagus, because sarcophagus was built in just 200 days after the accident in enormous radiation fields, and projected lifetime was 20 years, 40 years gone. So we need to dismantle it to avoid uncontrolled collapse of this, because beneath this there are hundreds of tons of fuel-containing materials, including uranium, plutonium, and trans-uranium elements. And of course, if something will collapse suddenly or as a result of another heat of another rocket, this radioactive dust will rise, and new safe confinement, which now do not provide all safety functions which was envisaged because of this drone attack, now it's not hermetic, not sealed. This radioactive dust could rise, and the cloud could go anyway. As what 1996 learned us that Swedish nuclear power plant, Forsmark, detected radioactive particles from Chernobyl already at the night of 28th of April, in 3 days. I don't like to share all these insights, because after each of such interviews, there are a spike in the media that everything is bad, and it provokes like a chain reaction. You need to refute that headlines and so on and so on. Sometimes we need to have time to work.
Serhii, thank you very much for delicately explaining the dangers there of nuclear safety. But there's a distinction. That safety, which is, you've described so eloquently, is different from nuclear security. There's two issues really that we're dealing with in this war. Mariano, I want to ask you about not safety but security, and we turn to Zaporizhia for that. So just remind us what happened there, and what are the current challenges that are being faced? I mean, it was in the news for a long time. Where are we with Zaporizhia?
Right. Well, thank you so much for the question. Thank you to organizers for staging this panel, commemorating this really important event. So when on February 24th, 2022. We all watched glued to whatever media was in front of us at what is happening in Ukraine, and in particular, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the exclusion zone, in a way that paled compared to what would happen just a week later at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The coverage, the photos and videos of the brave people of Enerhodar, the satellite city of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, coming out in thousands to the checkpoint, to trying to stop the advance of the Russian armored column that came up to that checkpoint. They were watched the world over. But of course, civilians are no match for, a Russian army. And on the night of March 3rd, on the afternoon of March 3rd, basically the armored column blew through that checkpoint and went straight for the nuclear power plant. I have to say, this is my current research is to document what had happened then, and I had the privilege to interview dozens of people, of operators from Zaporizhzhia, of citizens of Enerhodar. Not a single one person said they expected this to happen. They were so assured that this is inconceivable. And when I ask why, they say, but we are part of this international regime that clearly prohibits. This is, a civilian nuclear facility with 6 megaton reactors, 1 gigaton.
A lot.
Gigawatt reactor, sorry.
A lot.
Yeah, so 6 in total, several of them working at capacity on that night. No sane person in the world would dare to shoot at that nuclear facility, and yet this happened. And another point of dismay was an expectation that some major reaction would ensue. A major international reaction, that suddenly the world would just stand up and say, this is unacceptable. And yet that, in a way, outside of general condemnation, that in a way did not happen either.
Now, we heard from the Director General of the IAEA. You've been speaking to the former Director General of the IAEA. Just tell us about that interview.
Yes, so I did have the privilege to interview Hans Blix, the former Director General of the IAEA, who was the head of the agency when the Chernobyl accident happened. He has still very vivid recollections of the accident and his own role in trying to help and mitigate the consequences. And I know we have a recording from Hans Blix.
Let's have a listen to it now, if we can. That interview, please, with Hans Blix.
Hello, everybody. The accident occurred between this Friday and Saturday, the 26th of April, and we knew nothing about it until the Monday after. The Swedish Minister of the Environment, Birgitta Dahl, phoned me that day, Monday, and she said they had measured increased radioactivity at 2 Swedish nuclear power plants, and she asked whether we had any information of any accident or anything that could have caused it. My staff then checked with various capitals but had no reply. In the same evening, Monday evening, however, the Russians came out with an official communique and explained that a big accident had taken place. They were subjected to much criticism around the world for having sent in their communique so late, because much radioactivity had come out in the air and the winds were northwesterly, and they came over Belarus and over Finland and Sweden, and precautions could not be taken until they knew more about the origin of the radioactivity. However, we replied to Moscow then that we felt sincerely sorry for what had happened and regretted it, and asked them if we had something we could help, we would like to do so. We had no response to that for the whole week, actually, but on the Sunday, I had a call from the Soviet ambassador, Oleg Klestov, and he said that he had an invitation for me with 2 collaborators to come to Moscow. And I said, well, give it a visa and we'll go tomorrow. And we did, we'll go on the Monday. So the collaborators whom I brought was the head of the nuclear power department of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Leonard Konstantinov, and the head of the nuclear safety division, Morris Rosen. So the 3 of us went to Moscow. And we were then taken by the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Mr. Petrosians, and we were briefed by him and by people from the foreign ministry. We did not demand to be invited to Chernobyl, but we assumed, or as I answered to questions, that said if we are invited, we will go. And we then had the invitation, and we flew down to Kyiv together with Professor Velikov, who was vice president of the Soviet Scientific Academy. And in Kyiv, we were briefed and then taken by helicopter to fly over Chernobyl. And I can still remember the black smoke who came out of the damaged, destroyed reactor. Then we returned to Moscow, and in Moscow, they had arranged for us to give a press conference. And I was giving the press conference in relatively simple terms. I think that he had a great success in his calculation, that it was valuable to have an impartial voice coming in, because not only the international opinion, but the Soviet people had not believed its own government. We flew back immediately to Vienna, and we called the meeting of the Board of Governors of the IAEA, and there was a great interest, what could we do? We took decisions then that, first of all, we would, for the future, the most important thing was to learn from this disaster. We didn't know the full scope of it, but we felt the international organization of which the Soviet Union was a member had a duty, first of all, to let the world partake of all the experience and really examine its detail of what had caused it and what could have avoided. Generally, the conclusion has been that the accident was caused by a combination of errors from the operators and weaknesses in the construction. The construction of the RMMK, which is influenced by various factors like the need to, or the wish to produce more plutonium, the construction had been criticized abroad even before the accident occurred. So, and perhaps the Russians try to play that down a bit, but that is an element of it. On the operators, they were well-trained people, but the Soviet system did not encourage personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. I think that the philosophy in the nuclear safety culture is certainly to respect the instructions, but it's also to be alert, to be questioning themselves. So this is an important experience, yeah. And I think one that speaks in favor of societies with a greater amount of freedom of thinking. Now, much greater healing is needed in Ukraine today.
Okay, I think we'll have to
bring this. That comes sooner rather than later. It has lasted too long already, and I hope that my personal hope is that we will come to a situation of reviving one day the détente in Europe, that Russia will accept the kind of decolonization that France and the UK did accept, then we live on the same Eurasian landmass, and I think we better arrange it so that we don't shoot to pieces our
I'm going to have to, if we can bring this,
of power. The message is best wishes to the Ukraine.
if we can bring this to an end, because I need to talk to the panel.
The accident in 1986.
Yeah.
You need it even more today.
Can we bring the sound down?
And we, on the Swedish side and on the European side,
So,
are wholeheartedly with you and wish to see an end of this unjust and unnecessary war.
you wanted to... Thank you.
Just to bring this address to the present, you know, as much as we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to those liquidators and the firefighters who tried to mitigate the consequences of Chernobyl, I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to those Ukrainian nuclear operators that made sure that in the spring of 2022, you know, a huge accident did not happen at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Lars, listening to that perilous piece of history there, you know, one knows how serious things can get with nuclear power. Mariano was talking about the Zaporizhzhia power plant. The international response, I mean, there are prisoners essentially being held there, running the plant. I mean, how can you run a nuclear plant under so much pressure? What do you make of the international response of allowing what's going on at Zaporizhzhia?
This is a mixed picture. There is one thing that I think we should start by understanding, and that is that it's happened 3 times in world history that nuclear power plants or nuclear facilities have been occupied. The first time was the Sevastopol research reactor. People tend to forget that. That's in Crimea. That was the first time in 2014. The second was the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and thirdly, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. All 3 occasions has happened in Ukraine. All 3 times it's been done by Russia. So, but I will also here give a little bit of hope, because one of these 3 facilities has been released, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So it means if it has happened once, then it can happen again. And that has to be not only our hope, but also our strategy. To your question, well, I've had the privilege of leading 2 studies into what are the conditions for people under these circumstances. In the beginning, we mainly spoke with people from Chernobyl, later also from Zaporizhzhia, people who had left the facilities. And what they tell is actually harrowing stories. It is about how things that are, and this was mentioned before, things that are essentially safety matters that there are no technical mishaps, they turn into security matters. And I can mention one example at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as in all other nuclear power plants, are diesel generators for electricity production should there be a cutoff of the power lines. Under normal circumstances, it is a safety function to make sure that there is diesel in these diesel generators. But suddenly when you're on the occupation, it's something else. If there are soldiers, occupying soldiers walking around, and you have to perform this, then it becomes a security matter. But it's not a security matter towards the outside world, because they're already inside. So it becomes a little bit like in physics, where you have different dimensions hidden inside each other and so on. So there are things that are changing radically in terms of what is the makeup of these 2 spheres. And I would like to say that we will see, or we are seeing a thing played out that I think most people are not really comfortable with. And that is how there is, we always want to separate that there's peaceful nuclear uses and there are peaceful nuclear uses. But how peaceful is it if it is at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that the Russians are storing weapons and weapon systems inside the reactor hall? how peaceful is it if that at Chernobyl, before the war, there are all kinds of international cooperation projects and scientific projects, including Russian ministries and organizations. And then comes the war, and Russia sends the same people, the same institutions as occupiers that were there earlier on as cooperation partners in scientific work. And thirdly, and this is a grim issue that people speak too little about, and it is that with the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Russia has actually moved into doing something that is using a different kind of a nuclear deterrence measure. They in the beginning, in the early phases of the war, they were blatantly threatening with nuclear weapons. Now they're holding a nuclear facility. People know that they can cause an incident, an accident. They can threaten to do it. They have staged various things, like, for instance, fires in cooling towers and so on, where it then is, you see these plumes and people react and say, okay, is this then a release of radiation? So there is in the civilian sphere and the peaceful uses, there's been a migration into actually a military use, and that is incredibly unfortunate. And when this war is over, we have an incredible cleanup work to do. Thank you.
Romina, before I come to you, can we just all say thank you to Serhii? He needs to leave now, but a big round of applause for Serhii. Okay, Romina, thanks, Serhii. Romina, tell us about the other 3 nuclear power plants. Do they remain safe in this war in Ukraine, the other 3 in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question. So Energoatom, the nuclear utility of Ukraine that operates the other 3 nuclear power plants today, we heard from the energy minister of Lithuania, and I want to pick on that and pull the thread a bit more, that the nuclear workforce in Ukraine has had to work under circumstances that are just unimaginable. And this 30,000 strong workforce has been able to deliver reliable, safe power over the last 4 years of constant war, providing 55% of the electricity needs of Ukraine. And that is absolutely remarkable that they have been able to do so under conditions where you have the grid infrastructure getting destroyed, where you have constant drone attacks, where your supply chain has been totally disrupted, and yet they have shown up and continued working. So the testimony of their professionalism and of their resilience is absolutely remarkable, and it just blows my mind. So that's one. I've got 4 messages to give Joel. So that's one. The second one, we've heard Chernobyl and Fukushima mentioned a number of times today. I think what we are seeing now here with this 4 years of war in Ukraine is yet another major nuclear catastrophe that needs to be studied thoroughly. We've heard how the nuclear system was transformed after the Chernobyl accident. Fukushima has just marked 15 years since that catastrophe happened. And again, the nuclear system went through a major rewrite as a result of what we learned from that. I think the international agencies need to do a similar deep dive around resilience and what Ukraine has to teach the rest of the world on how we can make not only our facilities, but our workforce more resilient. So it's not only taking, but it's got a lot to give. I think that's my second message. My third message that we as a supervisory board at Energoatom are working on is how do we transition this company, this enterprise, away from the Soviet model of governance, of operations, and introduce international best practices. And I'll give a very specific example to show what I mean. Ukraine and Russia are the only 2 nuclear countries in the world that require their chief executive officer to have a nuclear license. No other nuclear country requires that. And what that means for Ukraine is, as we looking at bringing in a new management board, is we want to bring CEOs that are enterprise leaders that will bring this organization into an investable entity. And you don't need to have a nuclear license to do that. You need a chief nuclear officer whose focus is going to be around nuclear operations, nuclear safety. So we're bringing about that organization change, and we're getting the help of the regulator, of our shareholder in bringing about that change, and the international community for doing so. And I want to finish off at looking ahead, the light ahead. I am extremely optimistic about the future of Energoatom. It's a company that is a strategic asset to this nation, and it plays a very significant role and will continue to play a very critical role for this country as it rebuilds. And as you talk about nuclear facilities, as we're seeing in the rest of the world, as you look at energy security, as you look at economic development, as you look at decarbonization, whatever all the reasons are, Ukraine has all those reasons, plus rebuilding the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure that's been destroyed. Nuclear is going to play a big role. Ukraine's nuclear energy fleet is second only to France in Europe. And so as we look at the future, we are having serious discussions right now on how we get ready for that future. And so let me then sum up with Energoatom. Ukraine doesn't need our sympathy. It needs our support, whether it's around regulatory partnership, whether it's on financing, whether it's in know-how and best practices so Ukraine can leapfrog. And what it also needs by all of us in this room and our governments is the political courage to recognize and to call out that a Russian hand on a nuclear facility in Ukraine is a danger, a serious threat to each and every one of us, and that should be avoided at all costs. Thank you.
I'll stop Romina talking about political courage there. Political courage of a different kind. Let's talk about what decisions governments have to do. You've got the fears, which we have outlined, but you've got the hopes and necessity of nuclear power. So what is the future of Ukraine's nuclear power plan?
Thank you, Mark, for the question and for the good discussion. But I will prefer to change into the Ukrainian language. Please take translation. Who needs?
Working at the government for 3.5 years, I was responsible for management in the area of public policy on overcoming consequences of Chernobyl disaster. About 10% of time since the moment of the disaster until now, we had managed to do. This is for more than 35 years. Why it is important? Because at that stage, Ukraine was ready to move to the next stage of cleaning the Chernobyl power plant site from the consequences of the disaster. A lot has been done by Ukraine for that, by Ukraine and our partners. That was building the arch of the new safe confinement, which was very interesting. I had to push the chief engineer who was responsible for moving of this arch, and he was literally moving that arch. So a lot was done in terms of management of radioactive waste and nuclear fuel. But I would like to say that we must understand that for that time, Ukraine got the responsibility for management of consequences of that disaster. And we have lots of partners who helped us, but at the same time, we were slowed down and by Russian Federation in that process. What do we have now? Ukraine was prepared to transit to the second stage of cleaning these consequences of Chernobyl disaster. Under those confinement, which was ruined, there were cranes installed for dismantling of the old confinement, dismantling of the remains of the fourth unit, and Ukraine was working on finalizing its plan how to do that and how to clean this site fully. But the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation took place, and Russia forced us, and not only Ukraine, but the whole world, back to dozens of years. And now the situation has become uncontrolled to a large extent. We must understand that safe confinement has a membrane which was built in such a way that any radioactive threats be enclosed in the vacuum space and not let outside. Currently, the safe confinement which was built and was guaranteed to function for 100 years does not fulfill its function. Now we face an issue how to solve this problem. We need funds. We should remember that about $1.5 billion was used for building confinement. Currently, this damage caused by the drone led to roughly $500 million investment necessary to repair it. So we must understand that perpetrators, and we all know who is the perpetrator of this tragedy, is not prosecuted, and this evil, which is not prosecuted, continues doing evil things. Today we speak about Zaporizhzhia, where the nuclear power plant is the biggest in Europe, and it is not controlled by the world. We forget about drones and missiles flying over South Ukrainian nuclear power plant. We forget about attacks on substations which serve the existing nuclear power plants, and that was one of the reasons of disaster in Fukushima, because it was not cooled enough. So we see that the evil in the world supporting nuclear programs is not punished. Our colleagues from Lithuania who are here are in the zone of biggest risk from nuclear power plant in Ostrovets. It was built in Belarus by Russians, and Belarusians rejected any obligations in terms of international audit and environmental control. Also, there is information that when Russians were building a reactor in Ostrovets, there was certain accident, and they had to substitute some parts. And what would be the consequences? Nobody knows. When we speak about the disaster of 1986, we should speak about raising international control over the situation. And today we've heard from the AIA head, we heard it, there is no instruments which would control and create protocols of security before the Chernobyl disaster. But I would say that until now, this protocol is not effective. The most vivid example of this is the Fukushima disaster, which happened because lack of proper control. Unfortunately, the Japanese government, from my point of view, didn't allow AI to control it properly. Also, they do not have instruments to control situation in Zaporizhia. And this is a problem not only for Ukraine, but for our neighbors in Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia. It's a threat for all world because the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, or physical consequences of this disaster, were noted not only in Sweden. Sweden was the first country to speak about it, but it was also noticed in the United States. So the whole world should take necessary and effective steps to correct this situation.
So many issues, never enough time to discuss them. I want to thank the panel all very much. Ostap, Lars, Romina, Mariana. What a fascinating and important beginning of a discussion that we need to continue. Thank you all for your insights and expertise. Big round of applause. Rafael.